that is the big question right now as to whether the world is actually prepared for any sort of downturn that might come as a result of Russia's incursion into Ukraine.
Yeah, look, Ross, I think the US and its allies have really tailored the sanctions to make sure that does not happen. I mean, I think it's clear the sanctions were a lot less tough than what many people expected. Russia's still in SWIFT, and remarkably, there were no personal sanctions on the Russian president himself, which I think shocked a great number of people. And the biggest exports of Russia, so the biggest potential for a global downturn of sorts would have been to slap sanctions on those oil and gas exports. But as the president said earlier this week, the sanctions are tailored to make sure that those energy payments can still continue. So there's, in my view at least, not going to be a sharp downturn soon unless there's some sort of dramatic escalation of events in the coming days. We even saw the major stock indices in the US and in Europe, certainly Australia too, they bounced by about 1 to 2% immediately after the president spoke. So I'm pretty sure investors took away from the second round of sanctions that they were nowhere near the shock and awe that many people were expecting.
So it raises a pretty interesting question there, and that is whether indeed the economies of the Western world have been put ahead of the Ukraine people and the Ukraine state in this case. So therefore that Vladimir Putin has got his way, has walked into Ukraine, and the Western world has simply said, that's a really bad thing to do, but by the way, we're really not going to do anything serious about it.
Look, I think that's basically right. And look, it's very sad. I think it's a massive tragedy what's happened in Ukraine, but that's a fair assumption. I think they have put their economies ahead of the Ukrainian people. And who's to comment on the wisdom of that? I mean, these are very significant decisions that are being made. But the fact that Ukraine's not in NATO, that it's not in any significant military alliance, really means that it can be gobbled up by a much larger neighbour. And of course, that does set precedents elsewhere in the world, of course, in relation to Taiwan and China. There'd be a lot of worried people there. But look, it's not over yet. This invasion is certainly proceeding slowly, it seems. I mean, after the initial missile strike, there seems to be a pause. So Putin seems to be taking it slowly and seeing what the Western response is at every step.
Then you get to another aspect about even the use of these sanctions. They almost seem, in many ways, yes, OK, they have targeted Russian banks, they have targeted some of the oligarchs, but as you point out, they're pretty soft in comparison with what could have been done if you genuinely wanted to send a message. That again raises questions about whether this has been a serious response to what is quite clearly a very significant incursion into a country's national rights.
Well, look, it's no doubt that the sanctions will cause harm to Russia. They'll cause harm to its financial sector, to the various oligarch mates of the president. There's no question there, but it certainly seemed to me that there are a lot of holes in these sanctions. For instance, the financial sanctions, which have been trumpeted the most, the exclusion of the 10 largest banks from the US financial system, which apparently hold about 80% of the Russian banking system's assets. But the first thing I thought, well, what about the other smaller Russian banks who hold the other 20% of the assets? I mean, presumably they still have access to the Western financial system, and quite conceivably they could pick up the business of the banks that have been sanctioned. And then the other leg of the sanctions was the so-called ban on high-tech exports to Russia. And the president was saying that about half of those high-tech exports would be restricted. Well, I mean, again, what about the other half? And even the half that are restricted, presumably China, for instance, which of course is not involved in these sanctions at all. Now, it's not as sophisticated as the US is yet, but certainly it itself manufactures a lot of high-tech equipment, and it could take up the slack of those Western firms which are currently exporting into China.
Adam Creighton, always good to get your perspective, and many thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Ross.